In the beginning, there were only 5 Pokeballs. 4 of them were defined by how well they captured Pokemon, with each one being more powerful than the last. The other Pokeball, the odd one out, was not known for its catch rate. It was known for where it was used.
I am talking, of course, about the area-exclusive Safari Ball, a once prevalent staple of the series, now all but phased out. What happened to the Safari Ball? Why is it not seen that much anymore? And is it worth preserving? Let's take a look at the history of the Safari Ball and prove once and for all why it's one of the most important Pokeballs out there.
In its first appearance, the Safari Ball would have gone unnoticed by most players. The reason for this is because in Generation 1, every Pokeball just looked like this. And after a Pokemon was captured, you wouldn't see its Pokeball in its summary page or when it was sent out in battle. Starting in Generation 3, you can actually see the Pokeball your Pokemon was caught in, and that was when the Safari Ball started to truly matter. The Safari Ball, for most of the series, is an item that you could never hold in your bag under normal circumstances. Instead, it was used inside an area called the Safari Zone. There are 4 different iterations of the Safari Zone, and in battle, they all behave similarly. Instead of using your Pokemon to fight like in normal wild battles, you are prompted either to throw one of your 30 Safari Balls, or you can do some other action like throw a rock or bait at the Pokemon. Unlike normal wild battles, there is also a chance for the wild Pokemon to flee. This alternate battle system has never worked properly. There's a bunch of wacky math you can do to properly understand what actions will statistically give you the highest chance of catching the Pokemon, but who's gonna learn all that nonsense? The Safari Zone basically just boils down to luck. Most of the time when I encounter something, I just throw Safari Balls at it and hope for the best. While the fun of the Safari Zone is definitely not in the battling, looking for the Pokemon is what makes it enjoyable. Since the Safari Zone is dedicated to catching Pokemon, it always gives the player a large amount to choose from. The Safari Zone is also located usually just around the halfway point of the average story playthrough, so it's right at the end of when you are properly forming your team. In most playthroughs, I'll often have at least one Pokemon on my team that I got in the Safari Zone, and that Pokemon is made more memorable because of the Safari Ball that it calls home. While that's a small detail, it's something that has always mattered to me. The Safari Zone isn't even the only place that has an area-exclusive Pokeball. The bug catching contest in Johto was also a place where the Pokemon captured within that event were all placed in special Pokeballs called Sport Balls. If you want to hear more about the bug catching contest, I actually did a video on it a little while back. Link in the description. I'm actually not the biggest fan of the design of the Sport Ball. It's just a regular Pokeball with an S on it, and it's red. That's not very bug-like. Compared to the Safari Ball's absolutely iconic design, the Sport Ball just kinda falls flat. Regardless of its poor visual design, the Sport Ball still succeeds in giving a special identity to the small pool of Pokemon that are allowed to reside within it. Since the Sport Ball holds so few Pokemon, I am often encouraged to use a bug-catching contest Pokemon in Heart Gold and Soul Silver playthroughs. So thank you, Sport Ball, for encouraging me to use Venonat on my team. Probably wouldn't have done that otherwise. And I think that's what really makes the Safari Ball and the Sport Ball matter. Something as subtle as them just being different-looking Pokeballs encourages you as the player to use Pokemon caught in them. Small things like this can really change the gameplay experience for the better, and it's unfortunate that Pokemon has all but abandoned this concept. Since Generation 5, there has never been a new iteration of the Safari Zone. Now, on one hand, I kind of get the removal of the Safari Zone. Like I said earlier, catching Pokemon without battling them is just not as enjoyable, and the chance of wild Pokemon fleeing is extremely frustrating. So maybe the developers understood that and decided to phase out the Safari Zone. However, if that is the case, how do you explain the fact that they made Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which is basically an entire game where you don't battle wild encounters and those wild encounters can run away? It's also possible that the Safari Zone was phased out because by Generation 5 there had been so many Pokemon made and the amount of Pokemon a player had access to was already so large that In terms of game pacing, there was no longer a need to put an area where you have access to a bunch of new Pokemon towards the mid to late game. Or maybe they just ran out of different ways to implement the Safari Zone. It seems like every game that had a new Safari Zone was always trying to do something new with it. This led to mixed results. In Hoenn, the Safari Zone implemented using Pokeblocks in the Safari Zone. Pokeblocks are little Pokemon treats that you make using berries. In the Gen 3 Safari Zone, instead of having an unlimited amount of bait, you would have to use your Pokeblocks instead. And there were also these little areas that you could place Pokeblocks into that made Pokemon near it have a specific nature that corresponds to the Pokeblock place. This Pokeblock nonsense fell flat for a number of reasons. First off, it takes forever to even make one Pokeblock. You have to play this whole minigame in order to do it, and for the whole minigame to amount to nothing more than you threw the Pokeblock and then the Pokemon ran away anyway, most players, myself included, are just gonna throw their hands in the air and try to brute force Safari Balls instead. And worst of all, because Pokeblocks are a part of Gen 3 Safari Zone, there's this arbitrary rule where you can't even enter the Safari Zone unless you have a Pokeblock case. So you have to go out of your way to go to the contest hall and pick up a Pokeblock case in order to go into the Safari Zone. And once you're in the Safari Zone, you most likely will not even use the Pokeblock case at all. Sinnoh's Safari Zone learned from the mistakes of Hoenn's Safari Zone and is much more basic. The only gimmick to Sinnoh's Safari Zone is that once a day, certain rare encounters can appear, and you can use these binoculars to see what sort of encounter is there that day. I actually really like the Safari Zone gimmick, as it gives the player a reason to pick up the game every day. Sinnoh had a few other daily changing encounters, such as the swarms and the trophy garden, so combined with the Safari Zone, that was 3 new unique Pokemon you could find each day. Then there's Heart Gold and Soul Silver Safari Zone. Oh man, if the previous Safari Zone was one of the more simple ones, this one has got to be the most complicated. There's this whole thing where you can change the Safari Zone sections to different biomes that spawn different Pokemon, and then you can place down these furniture items that make certain Pokemon appear, but sometimes those Pokemon don't appear until real-world days have passed, and some of those can be over 100 days. Yes, you heard me right. You could be waiting for real-world months to get some of these Pokemon. So after all those different Safari Zones, maybe the developers thought by Gen 5 that they were just done with the concept. And you know what? I respect that. The early games had Safari Zones, they didn't feel it worked anymore, and so they stopped making them and decided to focus on other things. However, it's not the Safari Zone itself that I miss. It's the Safari Ball, or more specifically, special Pokeballs that only appear during certain events or can only be used in certain areas. To be fair, in Gen 5, the Dream Ball was kind of this, as it was used for Pokemon obtained in the Dream World and through Pokemon Dream Radar, and nowhere else. But after that, there really wasn't much else that was like the Safari Ball. This is a consistent pattern in the Pokemon series where they are, for some reason, extremely reluctant to make new Pokeballs. I've complained about this often on the channel since I'm a bit of a Pokeball connoisseur. I complained about it the most in my Moonball video, link in the description. Most of the Pokeballs in the Pokemon series were created by Generation 4, and very, very few were made afterwards. This is one of Pokemon's greatest missed potentials, and something I hope the series remedies moving forward. But the Safari Ball actually isn't gone from the series. In fact, it has appeared in recent games in a way that truly shows that area-exclusive Pokeballs are probably never coming back. From Generation 5 to Generation 7, the only way a Pokemon would be captured in a Safari Ball or Sport Ball would be if it were transferred from a previous game that had the Safari Zone or bug catching contest. But then, in Generation 8, in Pokemon Sword and Shield's DLC, they decided to make it possible to get the Safari Ball and the Sport Ball. This was the first time in the series that either of these items could be legitimately held onto by the player, and they could be used to capture just about any Pokemon. However, you probably didn't get either of these balls in Pokemon Sword and Shield, since each one has a 0.1% chance of being obtained after one puts 4 apricorns in the Cram-O-Matic. That means that you would get one on average once every 4,000 apricorns. And then, since the Safari Ball and Sport Ball have the same catch rate as a Great Ball, when you use it, the Pokemon will probably just break out of it, making the whole thing amount to nothing. In Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, the odds got a little better with its Cram-O-Matic equivalent, the item printer, and they gave you a free one of each elsewhere in the game. In these games, the Safari Ball and Sport Ball are only about as rare as the Apricorn Balls. Still extremely rare, mind you, but not impossible to obtain. However, while I object to the rarity of the Apricorn Balls because I think that Apricorn Balls should be sold in shops with the likes of Quick Balls and Net Balls, I object to Safari Balls and Sport Balls being available in this way at all. I think making these Pokeballs obtainable and theoretically usable on just about any Pokemon completely ruins what they are supposed to be, which is area-exclusive Pokeballs that can only be used on a handful of special Pokemon. It's okay if they don't want to bring back the Safari Zone or the bug catching contest, but they should have allowed the Pokemon that were caught in those areas to remain special in their own right. But I'll end off the video with one last fun fact. Did you know that the Safari Ball originally looked like this? Yeah, the design isn't as cool, but that's what it would have looked like in Gen 1. You probably have never seen this version of the Safari Ball before, and that's because it was most prominently seen in an anime episode that never aired in English. If you want to hear more about this banned episode, check out my video over on my other channel about Ash's Tauros. I think you would really enjoy it. Or you could check out one of my other Pokeball related videos right here.
If you like what I do and want to see me do more of it, consider becoming a channel member or supporting my Patreon. Link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.